The woods do not forgive those who underestimate them. They stretch endlessly in silence, swallowing voices, footsteps, and sometimes entire lives. For centuries, people have entered forests under the simple belief that they would find peace, adventure, or solitude. Instead, what some find is a silence too heavy to bear, a presence that does not explain itself, and an ending that no one will ever understand. It is often said that the forest keeps secrets better than any human ever could. Paths overgrown by moss conceal the footprints of the lost, and rivers carry away the last traces of voices that once begged for help. No matter how many rescue teams enter the wilderness, no matter how many dogs sniff through the brush, some people are never found. They are claimed, as if the earth itself chose to keep them. And in the rare instances when their remains are recovered, the way they are found often raises more questions than answers. Clothing folded neatly on stones as though placed there intentionally. Campsites abandoned but left intact, meals still waiting. A single boot at the base of a tree but no trail to follow. Imagine a hiker disappearing less than half a mile from his friends, only for his body to be found months later in a place already searched dozens of times. Imagine a young woman screaming in the darkness, her voice echoing across the trees, but no tracks ever leading to her. Imagine families searching until their lives collapse, repeating the same question night after night. How does a person vanish into nothing? The forest does not answer. It only stares back with its endless eyes, with branches swaying like shadows, with winds that carry whispers no one can translate. It is within this silence that 3 stories begin. Each of them rooted in truth, each of them stained with fear, and each of them unresolved. They are not tales created for the comfort of audiences who crave simple resolutions. They are testimonies that resist closure, fragments of horror pulled from places where sunlight struggles to reach. The first begins on a trail that was not supposed to be dangerous. Families walked it every weekend. Children played along its edges while their parents unpacked lunches in the shade. Nothing about it appeared threatening. And yet one late afternoon, a boy wandered a short distance ahead of his father, following a path of rocks, and was never seen again. His father swore he only looked away for seconds. Searchers came in hundreds. Dogs were sent out. Helicopters hovered low above the trees. Nothing was found. Not a single scrap of fabric, not a shoe, not a broken branch that could explain his absence. Years later, hunters reported hearing a child's laughter deep in the woods, laughter that echoed where no child could be. The second is not about a child, but about a man who loved solitude. He had built his entire life around silence and the meditative peace of walking alone. He knew the wilderness better than most. He carried maps and compasses, and he always told others not to fear what they did not understand. He walked into the pines on an early morning and never came back. Weeks later, pieces of his journal were found lodged in the roots of a fallen tree. The pages spoke of shapes moving between the trunks, shadows that never retreated even when he turned to face them. His last words were the simplest and most terrifying. I am not alone here. The third story belongs to a woman who was driving late at night when her car broke down near a state forest. She called a friend for help, saying she would wait inside the vehicle until someone arrived. When the friend reached the road 30 minutes later, the car was there. The keys were still in the ignition. Her phone was on the seat, but she was gone. The woods along the roadside stretched for miles, and though people searched, she was never seen again. Some said they heard her voice days after, carried on the wind. Others said it was not her voice at all, but something using it. What unites these stories is not just disappearance. It is the sense of being consumed. The trees, the air, the soil, each story suggests that the forest is not passive but attentive. It watches, it waits, and when it chooses, it takes. There are those who argue that accidents explain everything, that animals carry away remains, that exposure kills quickly, that human error is the real culprit. Yet even among the most rational, there is a moment when explanations begin to feel too thin, when details resist logic, when silence presses in with a weight no one can explain away. That is when the forest feels less like a setting and more like a presence. Perhaps the most disturbing question is not how people vanish, but why. Why do so many disappear just outside the reach of safety, only steps away from companions, from roads, from rescue? Why are items left behind so deliberately, as if arranged? Why are some found in places previously searched, lying in plain sight as if placed back after the searchers gave up? The woods will not provide an answer. They never do. What remains are the stories, the fragments of truth carried back from the wilderness. They are spoken quietly, repeated with unease, told around campfires and in police reports, and whispered by families who still wait for the sound of footsteps returning home. And tonight, you will hear 3 of them. 3 stories of people who entered the woods and never truly returned. 3 stories that suggest the forest is not empty. 3 stories that ask you, in the deepest hours of night, one question you may never want to face. When you are alone in the woods, are you really alone? The story begins in a place that did not look like it belonged to horror. It was a stretch of woodland on the edge of a quiet rural town, a place where families escaped the noise of the world, and where children learned to climb trees and skim stones across shallow streams. The trail itself was short, less than 2 miles from beginning to end, and it circled a small lake that reflected the sky with deceptive calm. For the people who lived nearby, it was more than a trail. It was a tradition. Couples walked it on first dates. Elderly men sat on benches with fishing rods propped against their knees. Families brought their children on summer weekends, carrying paper bags filled with sandwiches and bottles of soda. To the town, the forest was harmless. It was familiar. The boy who disappeared was not supposed to be alone. He had come with his father, a man who worked long shifts in a factory that roared with iron and heat. Weekends were rare gifts, and he gave them all to his son. They walked that trail often, side by side, with the father pointing out birds perched on branches, teaching the boy to notice tracks pressed into the dirt. There was nothing unusual about the day it happened. The air was warm, the trail was busy with other families, and there was no reason to fear. They were no more than 20 minutes from their car when the father allowed his son to walk a few steps ahead, following a line of stones that curved toward the water. The town later remembered the father's face when he came running out of the woods screaming. People said he looked more like a wounded animal than a man, his voice torn apart by panic. Some ran to help, others froze, but all of them remembered how his hands shook when he tried to speak. He kept repeating the same words over and over. He was right there, he was right there. Searchers arrived within the hour. Neighbors, police officers, men with dogs. They combed the forest until their voices cracked. They shouted the boy's name until night fell and lanterns lit the trees like fireflies. But the boy did not answer. The forest gave nothing back. As the days passed, the search grew larger. Hundreds of volunteers joined, their boots flattening every trail, their hands pushing aside branches, their eyes searching for any piece of fabric, any footprint in the soil. The lake was dragged, divers went below the surface, and helicopters circled overhead. Nothing appeared. The forest seemed empty, untouched, as though no child had ever entered it at all. The town tried to explain it away. They said maybe the boy had run further ahead than anyone realized, that perhaps he wandered off the trail and became lost in the thicker brush. They told themselves that children were quick, that a few steps could mean a mile when no one was looking. They clung to these explanations because the alternative was unbearable. To imagine something deliberate, something intentional, was to admit that the woods they trusted were capable of cruelty. But even in those early days, strange details unsettled the searchers. The boy had been less than 30 feet ahead of his father when he vanished. In that space there was nothing unusual. No cliffs, no rivers, no obstacles to suggest a fall or a sudden accident. The trail itself was wide and well kept, with no forks that could confuse a child. And when trackers followed the ground, they found footprints leading into the brush. Then abruptly they stopped, as if the boy had taken a step and simply ceased to exist. The father never returned to the trail. In the weeks after, he spent his nights sitting in the boy's room, the bed untouched, the toys in place, waiting for footsteps that never came. His neighbors said he stopped speaking. When people tried to console him, he only shook his head, as if words had no meaning anymore. His life was not destroyed all at once. It was dismantled slowly, piece by piece, by the silence that replaced the voice of his son. The town carried the wound as well. Parents stopped bringing their children to the trail. The lake grew quiet, its benches empty. A place once filled with laughter became still, haunted not by the sound of screams but by the lack of them. People crossed the road on their way to work and avoided looking into the trees. They whispered to each other in grocery stores, saying they should not let one tragedy ruin their traditions. But they did not return. The forest had been changed in their minds. It was no longer gentle. As months turned into years, the boy's name was carved into the memory of the town like an open wound that never healed. His photograph was pinned on the bulletin board of the police station, then yellowed and curled at the edges. Families left flowers at the trailhead, though no one dared to walk far inside, and slowly the story became something else. It was no longer just the disappearance of a child. It was the birth of something unspoken. Rumors spread. Children whispered to each other that if you called his name 3 times at the lake, you could hear his laughter on the wind. Teenagers dared each other to walk alone at night, claiming that the boy would appear behind them if they did not look back. What began as grief had become legend, and legend always carries its own kind of weight. The town no longer spoke of the boy in practical terms. They did not ask where he went or how he vanished, because those questions had no answers. Instead, they asked different questions, questions that no one wanted to answer out loud. What if he never left? What if he was still there, just beyond the trees, waiting? The woods stood unchanged, but the way people saw them had shifted forever. And in that silence, in that shift from tragedy to fear, the story deepened into something that would not let go. In the beginning, the search was built on hope. Every hour that passed was another chance for the boy to be found crouched beneath a tree, frightened but alive, waiting for his father to arrive. Voices called his name in steady rhythms, echoing across the woods, bouncing from tree to tree like signals sent into darkness. People told themselves that children wandered, that children hid, that children were often braver than they looked. The boy would be cold, hungry, but not gone. That was what they believed. But by the second night, something shifted. The air itself seemed heavier. Searchers carried lanterns, their light flickering across the trunks, and more than one swore that shadows moved just outside their glow. Dogs pulled in strange directions, whining at nothing, refusing to move forward as though an unseen wall blocked their path. It was easy to dismiss at first. Tired eyes, nerves stretched thin. Yet when it began happening again and again, the murmurs grew louder. Something did not feel natural in those woods. Reports came back from the teams that combed the forest line by line. They said the woods seemed to twist back on themselves, as though the same ground was being covered no matter how far they pushed forward. Compass needles jittered when held in the open. Radios crackled with static, voices cut in half, words swallowed before they could reach another ear. There was a sense of interference that no one could explain. Some men laughed nervously and called it bad weather, a trick of magnetism. Others did not laugh at all. On the third day, the first piece of evidence appeared. It was a small toy car, half buried in soil near a fallen log less than 100 yards from where the boy was last seen. The father recognized it instantly. It was the boy's favorite, one he carried everywhere, but it should not have been there. That ground had already been searched. Dozens of people had walked past that very log, combing every inch, finding nothing. And yet now it appeared, placed neatly as if to be found. The discovery sparked a new urgency. Searchers pushed harder, louder, voices calling through the brush until their throats tore. But with urgency came exhaustion, and with exhaustion came mistakes. Some wandered off the designated lines. Others returned shaking, swearing they heard someone laughing deep in the trees. A few claimed they saw flashes of color, something small darting between trunks, a child's shape just out of reach. Each time they ran after it, there was nothing. The father began refusing to leave the forest at all. He walked with the searchers during the day, but at night he remained behind, his lantern burning low near the trail. Some said they saw him speaking to the darkness, whispering his son's name as though the woods could negotiate. When others tried to bring him back to town, he resisted, insisting he could still hear his boy's voice. No one argued with him directly. They pitied him, and perhaps they feared him too, for his face had changed into something hollow, as if the forest had already claimed a part of him. By the end of the first week, hope began to rot into unease. Everyone had expected evidence, scraps of fabric, footprints, broken branches, signs of struggle. Instead, there was nothing. The ground seemed untouched, the trees still. It was as though the forest had opened for one moment, taken what it wanted, and sealed itself shut again. The strangeness did not stop there. A group of volunteers swore they heard footsteps trailing them one evening, steady and deliberate, always a few paces behind, no matter how fast they walked. When they stopped, the sound stopped. When they moved again, it returned. They turned their lights back into the trees, but there was no one there. Another team claimed to hear a child humming, faint and tuneless, drifting across the branches. They followed it until it disappeared into silence, leaving them alone in the dark. At first, officials dismissed these accounts as exhaustion. Sleep deprivation, nerves, the paranoia of being in the woods too long. But behind closed doors, even they admitted the case was different. Something about the absence, the clean break from reality, made it unlike any other search they had done. Children went missing, yes. Children wandered. But they left traces. They cried out. They were found. This boy was not. The search stretched into weeks. Flyers were posted across the town, his face staring back from every telephone pole and shop window. But inside the forest, nothing changed. No matter how many new teams came in, no matter how many experts were brought, the result was the same. No sign, no sound. Just silence. Whispers spread through the community. Some believed the boy had been taken, not by an animal, but by someone who knew the woods better than anyone else. Others suggested something older, something that belonged to the forest itself. Children began refusing to go outside after dark. Families locked their doors earlier. Even those who never went near the trail found themselves waking at night, convinced they heard faint laughter on the wind. The mystery was not just the disappearance, it was the refusal of the forest to cooperate. Search dogs trained to follow human scent became useless, walking in circles before lying down, whining as if in defeat. Thermal cameras picked up no heat signatures. The woods gave back no echoes when voices called out as if sound itself was being swallowed. And still, the father remained. Day after day, his figure could be seen at the trailhead, staring into the trees, waiting. Some nights, people swore they saw his lantern still burning, swaying gently in the dark, as though he was still speaking into the silence, refusing to leave, refusing to accept. The buildup of the mystery was not one moment, but many small fractures. The compass that would not hold steady, the toy car that should not have been found, the voices that did not belong to anyone present. Each detail was small enough to dismiss, but together they formed a pattern, too disturbing to ignore. It was no longer just about where the boy had gone. The question that weighed heavier was what the forest was holding back, and why it chose silence over truth. The official reports began to take shape in fragments, each page filled with notes, measurements, and half-formed theories. On the surface, they looked like the kind of paperwork that follows any disappearance. Lists of times, coordinates, and observations carefully arranged. But when read closely, the documents felt less like answers and more like a catalog of confusion. The footprints were the first detail to confound investigators. At the point where the boy was last seen, his small tracks pressed into the soft soil, moving toward the brush. For several yards, the prints were clear. And then, without warning, they ended. There was no scuff of hesitation, no sign of a turn or stumble, no impression of falling. It was as if the earth beneath him stopped recording his existence. The trackers could not explain it. Some speculated the ground had hardened. Others suggested erosion. But in that short distance, the conditions of the soil had not changed. The prints simply stopped. Then there was the toy car, the object found days later near the log. The father identified it instantly. It was one of the few toys his son always carried. But the location was troubling. The area had been searched several times by different teams. If the car had been there from the beginning, it would have been noticed. Its placement felt intentional, almost staged, as though someone or something wanted it to be found at that moment. Forensic examination yielded nothing. No fingerprints, no trace of dirt inconsistent with the environment. Just a toy, ordinary and silent, made terrifying only by the impossibility of its appearance. Search logs recorded other anomalies. A group of volunteers reported hearing a whistle, a long, high-pitched note drifting from deep in the trees. At first they thought it was another search team signaling, but when they checked their radios, no one else admitted to using a whistle. The sound repeated at irregular intervals, always further away, always just enough to draw attention. When the men followed, the noise stopped, leaving them disoriented and unnerved. Another account came from a deputy sheriff who swore he saw movement near the waterline at dusk. He described it as a figure, small and quick, slipping behind a tree. He raised his light and advanced, but found only stillness. His written report ended with a sentence that unsettled even his colleagues. It did not feel like I was chasing someone. It felt like I was being led. The father himself provided testimony, though his words were fractured by grief. He told investigators he never heard his son cry out. No scream, no call for help. One moment his boy was there, walking no more than 30 feet ahead, and the next he was gone. The silence was what haunted him most. In his mind, if an animal had taken the boy, there would have been sound. If he had fallen, there would have been noise. But there was nothing. A gap in reality. A missing piece of sound that made no sense. Psychologists brought in to consult on the case suggested mass suggestion played a role in the strange reports. Exhaustion, fear, and stress could create illusions, they argued. The shadows seen in the trees, the laughter heard on the wind, the footsteps trailing the searchers. These could all be the product of minds pushed past their limits. It was a reasonable explanation, but the question that lingered was why so many experienced the same sensations in the same place. More troubling still were the radio logs. Teams reported frequent interruptions, bursts of static, garbled words, entire channels collapsing into silence before suddenly returning. At times, voices came through that did not belong to any of the searchers. They were faint, muffled, like speech transmitted from somewhere deep underground. Operators could not identify the source. In one particularly chilling instance, a fragment of what sounded like a child's voice came across the line, distorted but recognizable as laughter. When headquarters asked which team had transmitted, no one claimed responsibility. Artifacts of the search began to accumulate. Photographs taken by volunteers revealed strange blurs of light between the trees. Faint streaks like pale figures caught mid-motion. Equipment left overnight sometimes malfunctioned. Batteries drained without reason. Cameras recorded only darkness despite being tested minutes before. The investigators cataloged these incidents, but the reports offered no conclusions. Each anomaly was recorded as inconclusive. Locals brought their own perspectives, though officials largely dismissed them. Some spoke of older stories. Warnings passed down through families that the forest was not safe after dark. They recalled tales of voices calling children from the tree line, of lights seen moving without source, of hunters who followed sounds only to return days later with no memory of where they had gone. The officials marked these accounts as folklore in the files, separating them from the tangible evidence. Yet those who lived closest to the forest insisted the stories were not exaggerations. They were warnings ignored. The deeper the investigation went, the less certain it became. Every explanation unraveled. Every theory dissolved. The boy had not been swept into the lake. Divers had searched thoroughly. He had not been taken by an animal. There were no signs of struggle, no drag marks, no blood. He had not wandered off unnoticed. His father had watched him until the final second. The woods offered no answers. What remained was a pattern. An absence too clean. A silence too deliberate. In the files, it looked like an unfinished puzzle. Pieces scattered with no way to connect them. To the town, it looked like something far worse. They stopped asking for solutions. They stopped pretending the forest would explain itself. The evidence, if anything, only deepened the wound. It suggested not error, not chance, but something selective, as if the boy had been taken not by accident but by choice, though whose choice no one dared to name. The investigators eventually left. The reports were filed. The photographs were locked away. But the father remained, his lantern glowing at the trailhead, whispering into the trees. And those who knew the story best understood the truth. It was not a mystery to be solved. It was a question left hanging in the air, a question that no one wanted to speak out loud. What does a forest do with the lives it takes? The search ended, but the silence did not. Officially, the boy was marked as missing, presumed dead. The files were closed, the equipment packed away, and the volunteers sent home. But the wound did not close. It spread quietly, like a sickness without cure, carried in the minds of everyone who had walked into those woods and walked back out without him. The father was the one who suffered most visibly. He no longer worked, no longer slept, no longer ate without force. His life bent around the absence, his days collapsing into nights spent sitting in a chair by the boy's empty bed. Neighbors said they heard him at dawn, speaking softly into the quiet, repeating the same questions as though answers might finally form. Where are you? Why did you leave me? He did not move from the house except to return to the trail. People who passed on the road said they saw him sitting near the tree line, lantern lit even in daylight, waiting as though the boy might step back onto the path at any moment. But grief is never contained to one person. It spread outward into the town, touching lives that had no direct connection to the boy. Mothers held their children tighter, unwilling to let them out of sight for even a moment. Fathers who once taught their sons to fish by the lake stopped visiting the water entirely. The trail once alive with voices fell into abandonment. It grew over, branches reaching across the path, the benches covered in moss. The forest seemed to take its silence back piece by piece, as though reclaiming what had been lost. Psychological scars appeared in those who searched as well. Volunteers who had combed the woods reported nightmares that lasted for years. They dreamed of walking the same lines again and again, only to realize the trees never ended. Some dreamed of hearing a child's laughter, close at first, then distant, then right behind them. Waking did not bring relief. Many avoided the forest entirely afterward, refusing even to drive past it. For the father, time became meaningless. He measured his days not in hours, but in the absence of sound. At first he spoke to others, repeating every detail he remembered, trying to make them believe there was still a chance. But as the months stretched into years, his words faded. Silence consumed him the way it had consumed the boy. The few who tried to comfort him eventually stopped, realizing their presence changed nothing. He was locked inside a moment that would never end. The boy's disappearance also changed how the community saw the forest. It was no longer a place of beauty or refuge. It became a boundary. Parents warned their children not to go near it, not even to play at its edge. Teenagers dared each other to walk in at night, but even they grew cautious. Stories spread quickly. Some swore they heard the sound of small footsteps behind them when they wandered too close. Others claimed they saw a light flickering between the trees, faint as a lantern's glow, leading deeper into the brush before vanishing. What disturbed the town most was how the story refused to settle. Grief usually moves in waves: denial, anger, sorrow, acceptance. But here there was no acceptance. The case had no closure, no body to bury, no ritual to end it. Instead, the absence lived on, infecting new families, new generations. Children grew up hearing warnings from their parents, but they did not hear them as caution. They heard them as legend. The boy's story became something larger than one family's tragedy. It became a haunting that lived inside the community itself. The psychological weight was visible in subtle ways. People avoided looking into the forest as they drove past. Hunters who once relied on the woods for food stopped entirely, convinced that what waited inside was no longer natural. Even in daylight, there was a quiet dread, as if the trees themselves were watching. People who never stepped foot on the trail felt it too. The absence of laughter by the lake, the sight of benches left empty year after year, it was a reminder that something had happened there that no one could undo. Over time, the story began to distort. Some whispered that the boy had been taken not by accident but by something deliberate. They spoke of voices that called children into the woods, of shadows that shifted just out of sight. Others claimed he had never disappeared at all, but had been taken underground to a place no one would ever find. Whether these were stories born of grief or truth did not matter. What mattered was that they spread, carried in hushed tones, told to children before bed as warnings. The father remained the most chilling figure of all. Years after the disappearance, people still saw his lantern glowing at night, swaying faintly at the trailhead. Some said he spoke to the trees, bargaining with them, offering his own life in exchange for his son's return. Others swore they saw him walking deeper into the forest, always just out of reach of the road. His face grew thinner, his eyes hollow, as though the woods themselves were consuming him slowly. The greatest horror was not the boy's absence, but the way it hollowed out everything it touched. The community lived with the echo of his laughter, the memory of his face on posters that curled in the rain. Children grew up avoiding the forest, yet drawn to its edge by curiosity and dread, and the father became less a man and more a shadow, his life reduced to waiting for something that would never return. The psychological damage left behind was invisible, but it was permanent. The woods had not just taken a boy. They had taken peace, certainty, safety. They had replaced all of it with silence. And silence, carried long enough, becomes its own kind of voice, one that whispers at night, one that reminds you every time you step outside that someone you loved once walked into the trees and never came back. It was not just the boy who vanished. It was a piece of everyone who loved him, a piece of the town itself. And that is why the story never faded, because grief can soften, memory can blur, but the kind of silence that follows a disappearance like this never stops speaking. The investigations that followed, tried to carve order from something that resisted explanation. In the months after the boy's disappearance, agencies arrived from outside the region. State authorities, specialized trackers, even consultants who had worked on other missing child cases. They brought with them new equipment, new strategies, and the quiet confidence of people who believed every mystery could be solved if the right method was applied. But in the forest, their confidence faltered. The official narrative settled first on the simplest explanation. The boy had wandered too far, and the elements had taken him. Exposure, dehydration, disorientation, nature was unforgiving to the vulnerable. It was a story investigators had told before, and one that could comfort the public, yet it was a theory with cracks wide enough to see through. The footprints that ended abruptly did not match the image of a child staggering further into the woods. The absence of a body, of clothing, of bones even years later, did not align with natural death. And the boy had been no more than 30 feet from his father when he vanished. To wander too far in that span of time was impossible. Another theory emerged: abduction. Some argued that a predator could have taken advantage of the crowded trail, watching for an opportunity, seizing the boy and vanishing before anyone noticed. It was an explanation that allowed people to imagine a human face behind the horror, one that could be hunted, arrested, punished. But there was no evidence. No witness reported seeing a stranger near the boy. No unusual vehicles were spotted near the trailhead. No one suspicious was found. And the speed required, the seconds between when the father last saw his son and when he turned back, strained belief. To take a child in silence without leaving a trace and vanish into a forest already full of searchers required something beyond human. Animal attack was considered and dismissed almost immediately. If a predator had struck, the signs would have been obvious: drag marks, torn clothing, blood. The boy's father would have heard something: a scream, a cry, the sound of struggle. Instead, there was nothing. The silence was too complete. Experts who studied animal behavior confirmed what the searchers already knew. Nothing about the scene aligned with an attack. With each theory that collapsed, suspicion shifted towards something less tangible. Locals whispered about the forest itself, about stories passed quietly from one generation to the next. They spoke of voices that lured children into the trees, of shapes seen in the corner of the eye, of laughter that did not belong to anyone. To investigators, these were dismissed as folklore. To the families who lived closest to the woods, they were warnings. Some even claimed the boy's disappearance fit into a pattern, that others had gone missing in similar ways over the decades, their cases buried in old files, their names forgotten by those who did not live in the shadow of the forest. Psychological experts offered a different angle. They suggested that the father's grief and the community's paranoia had reshaped memory. They pointed to the accounts of laughter, the toy appearing in a place already searched, the reports of moving shadows. Stress, fear, and exhaustion could create distortions. When people wanted answers, they sometimes created them unconsciously. It was a theory that soothed officials, but it did not soothe those who had stood in the woods, who had heard things they could not explain. Other investigators leaned toward stranger possibilities. Some argued the boy had slipped into a natural hazard, an underground cave, a sinkhole hidden beneath the forest floor. Nature, they claimed, could conceal its own secrets, but thorough surveys turned up no such hazards. The land was examined, scanned, walked again and again. No gaps appeared, no holes revealed themselves. The earth remained unbroken. In later years, conspiracy grew around the case. Online forums dissected every piece of evidence, every word spoken by the father, every detail of the search logs. Some claimed government agencies knew more than they admitted, that the case was closed too quickly, that the evidence had been manipulated. Others tied the disappearance to larger patterns, clusters of missing people in national parks, strange statistics that showed unusual numbers of children vanishing in wooded areas. They spoke of a phenomenon ignored deliberately or otherwise by authorities. Among the most disturbing theories were those that suggested intention from something beyond human. Some spoke of abductions not by people, but by presences, beings that lived in the spaces between trees, that did not leave tracks, that moved silently through the woods and chose their victims. Others spoke of the boy being taken not outward but elsewhere, into a space that touched the forest but did not belong to the same world. These were not theories investigators ever put to paper, but they grew in the quiet spaces left behind, in the places where explanation collapsed. The father himself refused all theories. He dismissed the idea of wandering, denied the suggestion of abduction, ignored the whispers of folklore. He clung to one truth alone. His son had been there, within sight, within reach, and then he had not. That gap was his obsession. The silent fracture in reality he replayed endlessly in his mind. No explanation, no theory, no investigation could close it. In the end, the case became exactly what it had always been, a void. The files stacked in dusty cabinets marked unsolved. The theories whispered and debated but never proven. The trail remained empty, the lake still, the forest unchanged. And for those who knew the story, the theories mattered less than the silence they tried to fill. The investigation did not fail because it lacked effort. It failed because it sought something that perhaps was never meant to be found. The boy was gone, not by chance, not by mistake, but by a kind of removal that theories could only circle, never touch. And in that truth lay the most disturbing possibility of all, that the forest does not need explanations. It only needs silence. Years passed, but the forest did not forget. Trees thickened, branches tangled, the trail faded into overgrowth, yet the absence remained as sharp as the first day. It lingered not only in the father's hollow eyes, but in the way people avoided the woods altogether, as if the trees themselves had absorbed the memory of what they had taken. The lake sat still, its surface calm, but beneath it lay an atmosphere heavy with what had not been returned. For those who lived in the town, life moved on in form but not in spirit. There was no sense of closure. There was only endurance, as if everyone carried a wound that refused to scar over. The boy's name became a kind of forbidden word. At first it appeared everywhere, on posters and newspapers, and desperate pleas whispered in church pews. But over time, people stopped speaking it aloud. It was easier to say the child, the one who vanished, the trail incident. To speak his name felt like inviting the silence back into the room, summoning something that had never left. Yet even without words, his story persisted. It slipped into lullabies, into warnings to children not to stray too far, into the quiet way neighbors looked at one another whenever the forest was mentioned. The boy became not just a memory but a presence. The father aged inside the shadow of that presence. He no longer carried his lantern into the woods, but people still swore they saw light flickering between the trunks at night, faint as a candle flame. Some said it was him. Others said it was something else, using his grief as a mask. No one followed it. No one wanted to know. The father himself withered, his body still walking, but his life already consumed by the silence that had taken his son. He was last seen near the trailhead one autumn evening, standing still as the leaves fell around him. After that, he too vanished, not into the woods, but into the slow oblivion of a man who had no reason left to remain. The story might have ended there, sealed into memory. But it did not. People continued to report strange occurrences near the trail. Hikers claimed to hear footsteps following them, though when they turned, the path behind was empty. A fisherman swore he saw a child standing on the far bank of the lake, watching him in silence only to vanish when he blinked. Campers who dared to stay overnight woke to the sound of laughter drifting through the trees, laughter too small, too light, to belong to anyone but a child. For those who believed in reason, there were explanations. The mind plays tricks in places where silence grows too heavy. Memory reshapes itself in the dark. Fear gives weight to nothingness. But others asked harder questions. Why did the boy's toy appear where no one had seen it before? Why did his footprint stop mid-step without sign of struggle or turn? Why were there no remains, no bones, no fabric? Nothing that time and nature should have revealed. Theories continued to circle, each one incomplete. Some said the boy had been taken by someone who knew the forest better than anyone else, who lived unseen in its depths. Others whispered that the forest itself had chosen him, as though claiming an offering. Still others pointed to stranger possibilities, that the boy had slipped into another place entirely, one that touched the world only through the trees. None of these explanations could be proven. None of them erased the silence. Perhaps the most haunting reflection was the simplest. What if the forest was not dangerous because of predators or cliffs or hidden caves? What if the danger was its emptiness, its capacity to absorb a life so completely that nothing remained? What if the forest was not a place where something happened, but a place where things were undone? The story lingered because it was never solved. People fear death, but they can understand it. They can bury their dead, mark a grave, mourn what they can touch. But disappearance leaves nothing to hold, nothing to bury, nothing to explain. It leaves a silence that echoes endlessly, a question that gnaws at those left behind. That is why the trail remained empty, why the lake remained untouched, why the town never healed. The forest had rewritten reality in front of witnesses, and it had done so without explanation. The boy was gone. The father was gone. The trail was gone, swallowed by moss and time. Yet the story remained, and perhaps always would. People moved away, children grew older, generations shifted, but the whispers did not fade. They followed those who left. They haunted those who stayed. Even strangers who learned the story felt it settle in their minds, as though the silence had stretched further than the forest itself. There are those who still walk near the trailhead, though few admit it. Some claim they feel a sudden chill when they draw close, as if the air itself remembers. Others say they hear faint sounds carried by the wind, footsteps, laughter, the low voice of a father calling out into the dark. No one stays long. No one ever follows. And perhaps that is the true horror of the story. Not that the boy vanished, but that his absence still reaches out, still unsettles, still demands to be remembered. The forest took him, and in doing so, it took peace from everyone who knew his name. What remains is a silence that cannot be buried, a silence that continues to whisper a single question. If a child can disappear 30 feet from his father without a trace, what does that say about the ground beneath your own feet? The woods do not answer. They never do.